This is Zoey. She is a bright, precocious, quirky 9-year-old who loves Lala Loopsy dolls, cookie dough ice cream, chess, and the color pink. Zoey was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder when she was 5, but she really didn't understand the meaning of disability until her parents enrolled her in their neighborhood public school on the assumption that by law, the school would provide a range of appropriate services to ensure her social and academic success. So they were unprepared, to say the least, for the school's placement of Zoey in a regular classroom without any supports or accommodations because, as the principal openly acknowledged, the school district did not have the funds to provide them. By the 6th week of the semester, Zoey was having regular violent outbursts in a classroom with one completely flummoxed teacher who simply abandoned all attempts at educating Zoey, and 25 increasingly terrified students. She was left unsupervised and so would often just slip out of her classroom undetected and wander about the school hallways, until on one occasion she made it all the way to the parking lot before being stopped by her mother, who happened to be in the school lobby that day. After a lengthy and costly battle, Zoey's parents managed to have her transferred to the only elementary school in their district to offer a full-time, self-contained special education program run by a team of highly trained staff. And now, about a year and a half later, Zoey's thriving. She's earning excellent grades, participating in after-school activities, learning better to regulate her emotions, and even making friends. Zoey's story is all too familiar to students with disabilities and their caregivers. As Zoey's mother, it is intimately familiar to me. When I shared this story at an academic conference a few months ago, I was rather dismayed when the consensus from the scholars present seemed to be, well, I guess inclusive education is not always the answer for children with disabilities. I don't think that this was the moral of my story. Certainly I recognize that attempts to pursue inclusion, that is, the practice of educating children with and without disabilities together in the regular classroom, without any regard for individual need, can be just as harmful in some ways as earlier tendencies to keep children with disabilities segregated from their classmates. Yet I am also convinced that with the implementation of universal design for learning, Zoey's education in this regular environment would have been appropriate, and her chances at success much greater. In fact, universal design for learning not only has the potential to radically transform the meaning of inclusive education, but the very concept of disability. In 1975, Congress passed and has renewed several times since then a law that became known as the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, which ensures that children with disabilities receive a free and appropriate education in the least restrictive environment, usually the regular classroom. And since then, debates have swirled about the benefits of inclusive education, not just for children with disabilities, but also for their peers and their teachers. Proponents of inclusion stress the value of all children and their right to be included, regardless of their individual differences and abilities. Critics of inclusion, however, argue that certain children with disabilities can't learn through traditional teaching methods, and that they need more individualized instruction from certified special education teachers, usually in special education settings. But by far, the most ubiquitous criticism of inclusion emphasizes the negative impact on so-called non-disabled students. For example, a 2012 study published by a leading education journal expressed concern for regular ed students whose classrooms, it claimed, are being adapted to meet the needs of others. And it questioned the fairness of allocating funds to provide resources that benefit only about 12% of the student population. And this study reflects the widespread assumption that the regular classroom is rightly the province of non-disabled students, and some sort of neutral, value-free space that students with disabilities invade and disrupt through their very presence and their costly need for adaptation. What this view fails to recognize is that this space, far from neutral, is actually constructed according to some sort of mythical, able-bodied, neurotypical norm that neither reflects nor accommodates the wide range of diverse learners within it, regardless of whether these learners have been diagnosed with a disability. And judging from the disproportionate placement of culturally and linguistically diverse and minority and male students in disability categories and programs, it's also a space that makes some pretty broad assumptions based on dominant discourses of gender and race and culture. Another troubling aspect of this inclusion debate reflected in the study is the failure to recognize that, again, these so-called non-disabled students actually benefit from the supports and accommodations designed to assist students with disabilities. In fact, by making a distinction between the regular ed students and others, this study draws rigid but false divisions between those considered able-bodied, the norm, and those considered disabled, that is, anything that deviates from the norm. In other words, our built environment, our policies, even our attitudes make very little room for human variation, and in fact are modeled on, even privilege, bodies and minds deemed fit, capable, intelligent, and even beautiful. And therefore, any bodies and minds that do not move or look or act or think in ways according to these norms are automatically rendered disabled. Disability scholars attempt to challenge and dismantle these sorts of discourses by reimagining disability as a wide-ranging continuum that encompasses all bodies and minds, and through a social model that sees disability not as some sort of individual problem or affliction needing cure. The old medical model of disability, but rather largely the product of environments and attitudes and policies that fail to include the vast array of human particularities. So in other words, the goal is not to try to adapt diverse bodies and minds to rigid existing structures, but to radically reimagine these structures to make them fit diverse bodies and minds. The social model of disability. And this social model also recognizes the dependency of all individuals on external supports, technologies and interventions to survive, to flourish, or simply to make life easier. For example, so-called non-disabled individuals commonly rely on supports such as glasses, computers, and ladders, even warm clothing on a cold day. And nobody thinks twice about these uses. It's only supports used by so-called disabled individuals, things such as interpreters and wheelchairs, service animals, psychotropic drugs that are considered accommodations, expensive, unnecessary, even burdensome. Universal design for learning is the best example of the application of the social model of disability to educational approaches. It's based on neuroscientific evidence that individuals who vary widely in their backgrounds and abilities and motivations have different learning needs and different learning styles. Universal design for learning means the creation and implementation of teaching materials and methods that reduce barriers in the learning environment and that make learning accessible for all students. This is accomplished through the 3 UDL guidelines. The first, to offer students multiple methods of representation of course information through multiple formats, not just text, but digital formats and audiobooks, charts and graphs and pictures, music, materials that connect to students' backgrounds and languages and experiences. Second, to offer students multiple means for expressing what they know, not just written expression, but verbal expression through performance, the creation of artistic works, through website design or film production. And third, to offer students multiple means of engagement for motivating them to learn. Things such as collaborative work or group projects, through role-playing or games, service learning that connects knowledge inside of the classroom to life outside of it. So, unlike traditional methods that attempt to adapt diverse learners to typically inflexible curricula and materials, Universal Design for Learning proactively creates these materials at the outset to make them adapt to the needs of diverse learners, that social model. It recognizes the unfairness, even the futility, of using one approach, one set of materials, one form of assessment that tend to privilege one type of learner. As a quotation attributed to Einstein cautions, if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid. My journey with Zoey through the often frustrating terrain of inclusive education has generated my outrage over how little our educational institutions truly accommodate the needs of diverse learners. But it's also forced me to recognize the limitations of my own teaching approaches. I had long prided myself as a disability advocate and ally, but it never really occurred to me that my view of accommodations was in many ways inherently flawed. It assumed that accommodations were something from which only students with disabilities benefited. It offered accommodations on a case-by-case basis, always after the fact, never built into the curriculum from the start. And worst of all, it made a lot of ableist assumptions about my students' abilities to see and hear and think and understand English, organize and attend. And as I began to redesign my courses using UDL principles and guidelines, a process I'm still very much involved in, by the way, I began to recognize the tremendous possibilities of applying UDL not just to primary and secondary education, but to higher learning as well. And this has inspired me to work toward the creation of an Institute for a Universal Design for Learning, which I envision as a campus-wide resource to educate K-12 teachers and college faculty, students majoring in education, UDL principles and guidelines, and also to connect them to the technological systems, the curricular resources, and even instructional practices that make learning accessible for everyone. Ultimately, Universal Design for Learning locates value in productions of knowledge that have been traditionally ignored or marginalized, even denigrated. I was reminded of this recently while watching Zoey work on an assessment with her speech therapist. And the therapist was showing Zoey a series of pictures and asking her to form story arcs based on the information that the pictures collectively illustrated. The correct subject of one of the pictures, for example, was a mother nervously waving goodbye to her son who was boarding a school bus for the first time. But instead, Zoey grew fixated on the lower corner of the picture, where a cat sat looking rather forlornly in her view. And despite her therapist's insistence that her focus was incorrect, Zoey refused to alter her gaze and instead continued to worry about the cat. To whom did the cat belong, she wondered. Clearly, this cat was hungry. Who would feed the cat? And as her therapist grew visibly more frustrated, I stifled my impulse to laugh. After all, why was Zoey's concern for the cat wrong or misguided? Why was attention to the mother and son more valued? And perhaps most importantly, who gets to make this decision? Zoey's tendency to create knowledge from the margins allowed her to form new meaning about what she was seeing that disrupted and challenged the picture's master narratives. In much the same way, universal design for learning gives students and teachers the power to form new discourses that radically transform existing ideologies and institutions, and that create new, multiple understandings of the correct way to see and hear and think and know. Thank you.